Hey, what's up, y'all? My name is Graham Hutchins, and I'm a motion designer and visual effects artist in Austin, Texas, as well as a TA for Cinema 4D Basecamp and VFX for Motion. And today, we'll be taking a deep dive into 3D camera tracking, dynamics, and compositing using Cinema 4D, Redshift, and After Effects. We're going to start by looking at the shot we'll be working with, setting up our scene in Cinema 4D, adding some dynamic elements, and then rendering out assets for compositing. Finally, we'll stitch it all together in After Effects. If you want to follow along, feel free to download the working files from the link in the description below. Let's dive in. All right, let's have a look at the shot we're going to be working with. This is a 4K 30 frame per second clip that I shot on my Pixel 7 Pro. I rendered out a PNG sequence for us to work with. It's 4 seconds long, and we're going to be working and compositing at 1920 by 1080 just to save on some render time. So let's have a look at the shot and see what we're working with. So it's a little shaky, but I think the Cinema 4D tracker should be able to handle this pretty easily. We could do this in After Effects. The tracker I find in Cinema is a little more accurate, a little faster, and also a lot easier to refine and fix any problems. And since we're going to be building out our scene and our dynamics in Cinema, it kind of makes sense just to keep everything in one place. So let's hop over to Cinema 4D, and here we are. First things first, we're going to open up our project settings, controller Command D, and make sure that our frames per second is set correctly, 30 frames per second. Our time max is going to be 120 frames. And let's go into our bullet settings really quickly. This is where our dynamics settings are going to live. Let's make sure that our gravity is set to 981 instead of 1000, since that is the acceleration. 9.81 meters per second squared is gravity. All right, let's hop over into our tracking layout. Newer versions of Cinema 4D, I'm not a big fan of the tracking layout that they have. It seems to be missing a few things that I like to use, so I'm going to untick new layouts and then open up the old tracking layout. There's some tools down here that you're going to want to use. So first things first, we're going to double click and create a motion object, twirl that down, and we're going to load our footage. And so I've got our footage living in here, tracking plate, and we select that, and there's our footage. We're going to bump up the resampling to like 50% just so we can see things a little more clearly. And while we're here, we're also going to open up our render settings. Let's turn this to 1920 by 1080. All right, and we're going to go ahead and save. Save early, save often. Let's see, we're going to replace this. And so here we are. All right, we have our footage in, and let's hop over to the 2D tracking tab. Let's bump up the number of tracks to like 1500, and we're going to increase the minimum spacing to 25. Click Create Auto Tracks, and it creates all of these wonderful trackers. I'm not a huge fan of trackers living in tree branches. If it's a windy day, it can throw things off. So I like to come through here, and I just like to kind of clean this up like that. I use the lasso tool, and click Delete, and those trackers are gone. And so we're at the beginning of the shot, and we click track forward, and that is going to track forward. And so this is going to take a little bit of time on the first pass because it still needs to cache the images, but when you go back to add more trackers and refine the track, it should be very, very quick. So we're just going to hang out here. And with the magic of editing, we are finished. And let's just scan through here real quick and just kind of see what's going on. Yeah, we definitely got some good stuff here. Definitely have a lot fewer trackers at the end of the shot than we do at the beginning, but we can fix that. So right here, click, and that will bring up the motion tracker graph view. And this is, if we press H, that is going to frame everything, and we can kind of navigate this the same way that we navigate the curve editor in Cinema. And so we look here, we have at the beginning of the shot we have a lot of trackers. At the end of the shot, not so many trackers. And then we've also got some trackers with some red in them, and we can come in and kind of fix that with the filters. And so if we turn these off, we have a lot of trackers that are being eliminated for, because the length isn't too long, or if we hop over to the graph view, we've got some kind of crazy looking graphs here. It kind of indicates, also if we kind of skim through real quick and just look at some of the trackers, it's kind of crazy, right? And so this filter gives us the ability to remove some of these errant trackers. I'm not a huge fan of working in this view. I kind of like this one. I don't know, just personal preference. And so what we can do, we can bump up the minimum length. If you have any trackers active less than the minimum length you specify, it will filter them out and not use them for the camera solve. Smart acceleration we'll leave alone. We can start playing with the error threshold. If we bump this down, you'll see that a lot of that red is starting to go away, and somewhere around 12% is pretty good. So let's go to the end of the shot where we don't have enough trackers, and let's create some auto tracks. And so here we are. We have another set of trackers, and we're just going to track backwards. And as you can see, it goes a lot faster the second time. Yep, lots of good trackers here. And then let's just run to the middle of this, go right in the middle, and we'll create some more auto tracks. And we'll click auto track, and that should track forward and backward. And it's done. We have a lot of good tracking data that we can work with now. So let's close this up. Let's solve for our camera. So we're doing a full 3D reconstruction, and we're just going to leave this at unknown but constant. And we are going to run this 3D solver and give it a moment. Now we have our 3D solved camera. If we hop over to footage, we can create a background object. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a material using the image sequence that we're working with and apply it as a frontal projection, and this will help us build out our scene. Now if we click off motion tracker, you can see our 3D scene that's been created. And so if you look at the work plane here, this is not right. So we need to orient our scene. So I'm going to go back to the beginning. Now we're going to click back on motion tracker, and we're going to create a position constraint. A position constraint is telling Cinema you want this spot to be the center of the scene, and any new objects that you create are going to be created there. So we need to find a tracker that we like, and I think this one right here is going to work for us. So I'm going to click on that, and that's going to create the center of the scene. So if we click back over, there's our work plane, and there is 0 and X and Y and Z. So click back on motion tracker, and now we are going to create a vector constraint. And a vector constraint is basically a reference point for Cinema to say this direction, these 2 points that I'm clicking on are X, Y, or Z. And so I like this little seam right here on the curb. I've got a tracker here, and then I have a tracker here. Now that I've selected our points for our vector constraint, I'm gonna click on Z. And if we pop out of the motion tracker, we can see that the ground plane is starting to get correctly oriented. And if we go out to our 4-up view, we can see there's our camera, there's our scene, these are all of our tracking markers, and everything is starting to get oriented correctly. The last thing we need to do is we need to set a planar constraint. This is going to tell Cinema where to orient the work plane, and it's going to flatten things out a little bit. So if we create a planar constraint, and let's just pick, I think here, and here, and here. And if we scroll through, there's our planar constraint. And so now, if we look at our world, and I'm going to turn off these auto features just so we can clean this up. If we look at our work plane, everything is oriented correctly. And so let's hop out to this layout, and if we just drop a giant cube in here, let's make this a little bit smaller. And I know that this is 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters. So let's move it up 10 centimeters in Y. And if we scrub through, there you go. Yep, sticking pretty well, not really sliding. So looks like our track was successful. So let's delete this cube. Now I'm going to create the ground plane, and this is what we're going to be using as a collider body for our dynamics. So let's go to plane, and let's make sure that we are in object mode. Here we go. Let's push this back. All right, let's just cover that space, and let's go all the way to the end to make sure it's wide enough. All right, it looks like it is. And so I'm going to push this out a little bit. I just want this sitting right up to the crease here. What we can also do is we can also make this, and actually we'll let's just reduce the number of segments because we really only just need one. And now we're going to make this editable. Grab edge mode, and then grab this edge. And what we can do is we can start to kind of build out this scene a little bit right there. And let's tilt this just a little bit, and then we'll make. Let's do this world orientation and then pull this out like this. We can also turn our features back on, and if we pop out, we can see this is where the wall lives. So we're just going to scoot this over just a little bit more so it's in line with that, and then Control Command click, pull this up, and there's your wall. And so this is very quick and dirty. You could do something that's a lot more, let's turn X-ray on. You could do something that's a lot more built out. You've got some trees here. It really just depends on the needs for the scene. But yeah, for this one, we're just going to do something quick and dirty. And we're going to rename this to, let's call it ground. All right. And what we can do now is we can actually copy this background, Control or Command drag this up, and then that gives us our scene. In the motion tracker, if you untick show footage through camera, that will get rid of your footage. And I guess we can also, let's turn X-ray off, and there you go. And if we look, everything should stick nicely. I hope you've learned a lot so far, and if you really want to learn Cinema 4D, check out Cinema 4D Basecamp, part of the School of Motion core curriculum. If you want to learn professional compositing techniques, check out VFX for Motion to learn the practical knowledge for working with live action footage. If you're already familiar with Cinema 4D and want to take your skills to the next level, check out Cinema 4D Ascent to learn fundamental 3D concepts you need to know to create beautiful renders and tackle any task a studio or client might throw at you. Links are in the description. All right, what's next? Let's create our collider body. If we go to bullet tags, there's collider body, and let's create our emitter that we're going to be emitting our objects from. So let's do emitter, and here we go. And let's run back to the front of the scene. So there's our emitter at 0, 0, 0 in world space. Let's turn that off. We're just going to play this real quick and just see. So you see the particles going off. Let's run it back to the beginning. And we're going to rotate this 90 degrees, holding shift to constrain in 5-degree increments. And we're going to pull this way up out of view of camera. And then what I'd like to do, we're going to focus on this view, is I would like to make this emitter about as big as the ground plane that it's going to be dropping objects onto. So let's go to emitter, and we're going to make it much bigger in X. Kind of pull this over, and we're going to make it much, much bigger in Y, and then pull this up, and we're going to do it a little bit past where the camera is. Maybe make it a little bit smaller. Let's try like 1800. Okay, and this gives us, there we go. That's going to be our emitter. So if we look at it from this view and push it up a little bit so that it's off camera, there we go. We can see the particles that it's generating. Okay, now we need to go get the taco. And here's the taco. We're going to copy this, and we're going to paste it into our scene. Let's go back to our camera view. And let's go back to object, and there it is. Looks good. The scale seems to be right. And really what we do is we take the taco and we drop it into the emitter. Let's go to our emitter settings. Let's go to particle and show objects. If we hit play, we should start to see all the tacos. It's playing back a little bit slowly. We can fix that if we tick render instance, and that will save us on some geometry that it's processing. I don't know about y'all, but I like a lot of tacos, and this is not enough tacos. So let's bump this up to like 40 and 40. And if we see, we're raining tacos. Now, everything looks very uniform, so we can fix that. Let's look at our particle settings here. Got our birth rate set, stop emissions fine. Our scene is only 120 frames, so this should be fine. Lifetime is fine. Speed is good. Rotation is where we can start to, if you start to pull that over, you can see things are starting to change. And we'll do like 90. And now they're starting to fall down. We have a speed of 150 centimeters. We could probably maybe do a little bit of variation on that just to get a little bit more randomness into the dynamics. But this is your basic setup for your emitter. And so now we are going to create a rigid body. And so right click on the emitter, go to bullet tags, rigid body, and now you can see we've got tacos that are hitting the floor and bouncing around a little bit, maybe a little bit too much, but we can fix that. You'll notice there are also some tacos that are starting to fall through the floor, and there's a few things that we can do to address that as well. Let's turn off auto features. Okay, now we've got to look at our scene here. If we go into, let's start with the emitter. We're going to look at the shape here, and we're going to turn that to box. For the ground, it's already got it here. Static mesh is what you want. Everything else is looking pretty good. And now we're going to go back into the project settings and hop over to the bullet tab. Let's see, let's take a look at this. So we're good on our general. Let's go over to visualization. When we turn on visualization, what it's going to do is it's going to give you information about how the dynamics are interacting with each other. And we can turn some of this stuff off. We'll turn off collision shapes, turn off contact points, and as you can see, there's still a lot of tacos that are falling through our floor. And the way we fix that is we can come into expert, and while we're here, we're going to scale the scene down. I know the tacos are about 6.5 centimeters, so let's scale this scene down to 10 centimeters. What we want to do is we want to increase our steps per frame and our maximum solver iterations per step. The higher these values, the more precise the simulation will be. The trade-off is that your simulation will take longer to process. Let's bump up these values a bit to clean up the objects passing through the ground. So let's bump this up to like 20, and we'll do the other one to 20. Yep, I think that might have cleaned it up. I don't see any more falling through, so that's cool. So now that we've got that fixed, we can turn off visualization, and we can start messing around with the bounce, the physics of this. So let's hop over to our rigid body. I don't know, let's just crank this up to like 100 and see how silly it can be. Yeah, kind of bouncing all over the place. Let's drop this down to 50. Yeah, still a little too bouncy. I think 5 was just about right. We could probably come into a ground dynamics, and let's turn this down to like 50. So we get a little bit of bounce, but then it just kind of quickly dissipates. And yeah, we've got our curb here, and we've got some really cool things going on here with that. One thing that's a little bit tricky is we're using this box shape, and you have things like this that happen where it's on an edge, it lands on an edge and just stays there. I think it's doing it there too. No, it falls over. But the way around that is if you go up to your rigid body and you change your shape to a moving mesh, this is basically going to use the geometry, the actual geometry of the object. And it is more accurate, but it is also a lot more processing. So if you can see here, it just slows things down quite a bit. And so what we can do to kind of get around those standing up without having to have all that processing being done is, let's switch this back over to box. And if we go to our emitter, we have a seed number here. And so let's like bump that up like 2 notches. And that will change how these are being emitted. And if we look around, yeah, we don't have anything that's, oh, there's one. There's a strange fellow. Let's change that to 3. All right, we've got our dynamics working, but there's one more thing we need to fix. If we pop out of this camera view, actually let me rotate this around something, and let's just delete that so that we can see what we're looking at. Is that, see how there's space here between the ground plane and the taco? It has to do with the box shape that is being used to calculate the dynamics along with the scale of the scene. And what we can do here is we can increase the size increment. We'll do it like a centimeter at a time. So if we just hit play here, it might be negative actually. Okay, let's go find one. Let's do -1. There we go. That's starting to get a little bit. All right, let's stop here and let's just drill into this guy. And see, we've got it making contact. There's a little bit of intersection, but that's okay. And that should be good enough. Now that we have our dynamics working, right, first thing we're going to do is we are going to reapply this texture to the ground so we can see what we're seeing. We're going to start adding lighting to our scene by adding a dome light. Shift-C to bring up the commander, and we're going to do a search for dome. And there's our dome light. And let's go to the object tab in the dome light and untick background because we don't want to see it in our render. If we go to the details, we want to focus on the samples. Let me dock the Redshift render view here real quick. Make this a little bit bigger. Hit play. There is, and actually we'll untick bucket mode, and there's our scene. We're starting to get some shadows, which is cool. We're going to jump ahead a little bit. We're going to go ahead and add shadows to our AOV manager. Open up the render settings, Control or Command B, navigate to Redshift, and go to the AOV tab and click on Show AOV Manager. If we look down here, here's our shadows. We're going to go ahead and add that and then close this up. And when we do that, we're going to focus in on this part of the frame here. We can scroll to shadows, and if we do this in bucket mode, we can kind of get a sense of what this is going to look like when it renders. And if you notice, actually we'll just do this one. So this is with our samples at 64. If we start cranking this up, let's do like 1024. And if you see, it starts to clean this up a little bit. And if we double that, 248, or 2048 rather, you can see that cleans that up. We're knocking out a lot of that noise, and that's going to help us when we're compositing in After Effects. Let's frame this up. Let's turn all that off and go back to our beauty pass. At this point, we are going to add our shadow catcher. And the way we do that is we go to our ground object, and we're going to do a search, Shift-C, for RS object. And the RS object is going to allow us to turn this into a shadow catcher. If we go to the matte tab and override and tick enabled, we can add our shadow. We also want to make sure to untick receive shadow from mattes. So if we go into our shadow pass, we can kind of see what's going on here. We've got this shadow that's being created on our shadow catcher on our ground plane. We do not want that to render out. So when we untick receive shadows from mattes, that gets rid of that. So what we're left with is a black and white image that we can use as a Luma matte to adjust our shadows when we go to composite. The last thing we need to address with our shadow catcher is the alpha channel of our ground plane. If we go to our beauty pass and we look at our alpha channel, you can see here we still have opacity in our ground plane. And the way that we address that is we go to our Redshift object for our ground plane and we can tick effects alpha. There you go. As you can see, our alpha channel has been cleaned up and now we can render out our beauty pass with an alpha. Now that we have our lighting and our shadows sorted out, we are going to add the rest of our AOVs that we want to render out. So let's start with adding a puzzle mat. We're going to select puzzle mat and change the mode from material ID to object ID, and then change all of these colors to 1. We can select our emitter and do a search for RS object and add a Redshift object to the emitter. Go to the object ID tab and tick override and bump that up to 1. So what that does is we can't really see it until we render in bucket mode. And then once that processes, there we have it. And it's a little quirk of Redshift that you can't see your puzzle mat unless you are rendering in bucket mode. And so there is the object buffer that we're going to be using to hold out the tacos. Now we're going to add one last AOV to our AOV manager. I would like to add an ambient occlusion pass, but we're going to do it in kind of a different way. So we're going to add a custom AOV, select it, and we're going to name it AO for ambient occlusion. We are going to generate an ambient occlusion material in our material manager. So if we go to create Redshift utilities AO for ambient occlusion, and then we're going to take this ambient occlusion and drop it as the default material into our ambient occlusion AOV. What that does is we run this render view and we go to ambient occlusion and we can untick bucket mode, and that is going to be our ambient occlusion pass. Now that we have all of our AOVs set up, we are going to go into our render settings. Let's see, output, we're going to do all frames. Let's go to save, and I have some tokens here that are indicating what folders this is going to render out to. We want to do PNG 16-bit for both, alpha channel, straight alpha, 8-bit dithering, and then PNG 16-bit, and we're just going to leave all these unchecked. And then on Redshift, I believe everything else is looking good. I'm going to press Shift R to render out to our picture viewer. Our image sequences have finished rendering, and I have imported them into After Effects. They're right here. We're going to drop these into our comp. We want to make sure that we're compositing at 32 bits. You can hold Alt or Option and click to click through all the different options, and we're going to land on 32 bits. Let's turn all of these off, and let's take our beauty pass and put it toward the bottom and turn it on. And so let's go to the last frame. There are all of our tacos. So the first thing we can do is we can start color grading our tacos. So let's bring up the Lumetri color effect, and we'll go to basic correction. First thing we can do is white balance our tacos. We can take this eyedropper and let's find something white in the scene. I like the side of this house. And so that immediately warmed up our tacos. Let me see here. We can start playing with the contrast. Let's just totally drain all the contrast out of it and then just kind of dial it back in until we find something that we like. Yeah, maybe like right there. Exposure. Let's kind of dial this in. We can take it way out and then just kind of pull it back. Yeah, maybe something like that, which isn't much. And that's just a basic correction that we have. So what we can start doing now is we can start to affect the shadows and the ambient occlusion. And we're going to use our shadow pass in conjunction with a adjustment layer. So if you hit Control Option or Command Option Y, that brings up an adjustment layer. And we're going to call this one Shadow CC. And we are going to put it below our shadow mat. We're going to take the pick whip and we are going to pick whip to our shadows. And we want to be sure that we are on a Luma mat. Let's just throw, we'll just throw levels in here real quick and then just crank it to 11. There are our shadows. And if we take the gamma here in the middle, let's just reset that to 1. And we can start dialing this in to kind of match the scene around it. These are a little strong just out of the box, so let's dial these back just a skosh until we're getting somewhere where they're not too prominent. Yeah, maybe something like that. What's cool is we have our ambient occlusion pass, and that we're going to use to affect the taco itself and really just the inside of the taco. We're really more focused on this shadow. See, this shadow right here that's meeting the ground plane. We can add another levels. We can affect some of the color channels. So I like to go into the blue channel, and if we crank that up to 11, and it starts to turn yellow, and so we really want to kind of cool it off just a little bit, just a drop or two. So maybe like that. And it's very subtle, but it just kind of helps things sit in the scene a little bit better. All right, now we're gonna go on to our ambient occlusion, and here's our ambient occlusion pass. We are gonna have to kind of work with this a little bit. So what I would like to do is I would like to take our ambient occlusion, I'm gonna duplicate our puzzle mat, and we'll just keep one right here, and we'll just keep one right here. And so I want to pre-compose our ambient occlusion with a puzzle mat, and we're just going to call this ambient occlusion mat. So we're going to drill into this, and what I would like to do is I would like to use this puzzle mat to hold out this ambient occlusion. So we're going to use a track mat. We're going to call it a luma mat, and so there you go. There is our ambient occlusion with a transparent background. We're going to add a background, a white solid, and we're going to send that to the bottom like so, and then we are going to put another adjustment layer on top of everything, and we're going to call this one invert. We're going to do a search for invert and add an invert effect and flip the black and the white in the scene. And this is going to give us our luma mat that we're going to use to hold out our ambient occlusion. We're going to add an adjustment layer, and we're going to call this ambient occlusion CC, and we are going to pick whip it to the AO mat, and we're going to use our luma. We're going to add another levels, and we're really just kind of looking right in here is kind of what we want to affect. So we're just going to play. If we bring our gamma down, and that just kind of darkens things. Now if you take it way too far, it starts looking not so great. But I think something like that. Yeah, just something to give it a little bit more contrast. Just a little darkness right there. That's a little bit too much. Let's dial that back just a little bit. So we have our taco color correction. We have the shadows that we're dialing back, and then we have this ambient occlusion that we're bringing back in to add a little bit of contrast and darkness to the inside of the taco. From here we can start to add our finishing touches to our comp. So the next thing we want to do is we want to add some motion blur. So we are going to do a quick search for pixel motion blur, and we're going to add that to our beauty pass. If you notice right away, it drains the color out of it. Basically, when you put it over your lumetri color, it's going to negate it. So we're just going to put that right above it, and that will fix it. I like 180 degrees for the shutter angle. We're going to increase the samples to like 10, and then we're going to increase the vector detail to 50, and that's just going to give it a little bit cleaner look. And so if we hop to somewhere where we have some more tacos populating, you can see the motion blur that's being added. It's doing it on some of the more extreme fast tacos, but then it's also adding a little bit to what we have on the ground in order to match the camera motion. So if we flip that on and off, you can see what it's doing. All right, we've got our motion blur going. The next step is to add color correction to the entire shot. I'm gonna create an adjustment layer and we're gonna call that 1cc for color correction. And then we're gonna add the Lumetri color effect. We're just gonna go into our basic correction and we're gonna white balance. That's a little bit warm for my taste, so we're just gonna dial that back just a bit. Kind of A/B it. Maybe, yeah, I don't want that magenta. And we'll keep it away from the green. Okay. Yeah, that warms it up just a little bit. And we could probably bring our exposure up a little bit. And our contrast. And saturation's getting a little out of control, so let's dial that back just a little bit. Okay. So before, after, just goosing the contrast a little bit, bringing in a little bit of saturation, and cooling things off just a bit. Okay. And last thing, we're going to add a vignette. So we're going to add one more adjustment layer. We're going to call that one vignette, and we're going to add a levels to it. We're going to push this up here, and then in the vignette we're going to add a mask. Let's grab the ellipse tool and double click to add the ellipse to fill in the frame, and we're going to say subtract, and then we're going to feather, and we're going to do like 300. We're also going to kind of shape our ellipse a little bit so that it's not quite so perfect. Just a little bit, just to give it a little bit of non-uniformity. So that's our vignette, and we can kind of dial that back. If we play around with the opacity, if we press T to bring up opacity, we can kind of dial that in. And I can also press Control or Command Shift H and take off the UI, and so we can kind of dial that into taste, maybe something like, so that's 0, and we'll just start to bring it back in just a bit. All right, our RAM preview has finished. Let's make this full screen and let's watch it. Yep, the only thing left to do now is send it to the render queue. It's raining tacos. It's raining tacos. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel so that we can teach you even more design and animation tips. Head to schoolofmotion.com to learn more about our interactive online curriculum and let our team know if you have any questions. See if you can take what you learned in this lesson and shoot something and add your own dynamic elements to it. I'd love to see it. Later, y'all.